Good evening, and thank you for your interest in my book, which is about an Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi era. The Afro-Caribbean is the gentleman in this picture. He was one of the few Black people to be a prisoner of the Nazi concentration camp system in World War II. His name was Lionel Romney, and he was my father. My name is Mary Romeny-Schaab. I'm going to be talking to you about where and when my father lived. Then I will outline his World War II experience, followed by a description of Mauthausen, which is the name of the concentration camp where he was imprisoned. And then in his own words, you will hear him talking about his experience in Mauthausen. I will say a word about his survival, and I will conclude with a comment about why I wrote my book about my father's wartime experience. And my book is depicted on the left. So again, this is my father's name, Lionel Romney. This is when he lived, and this is his life in geographical terms. Rather than explain it all, I'll just say that number 1 is meant to represent the Dutch side of the island of St. Martin in the Caribbean, which was where my father was from. And number 2 is meant to represent the islands of Aruba and Curacao and the country of Venezuela, which are 3 more places where my father lived in his pre-war life. I'm now going to outline his World War II experience as he told it to me in his oral history. The oral history that I recorded with my father was the source of the information about him in my book. As a civilian, he was a sailor on cargo ships sailing between the Caribbean, North America, and Europe from the mid-1930s until 1940. And in June 1940, he was aboard the SS Makis, which was a Greek merchant ship sailing through the Mediterranean on its way to Greece. When the ship reached the area between Tunisia and Sicily, it struck a floating mine. As you know, a mine is an explosive device. And when it struck the mine, it sank, but the crew was rescued by the Italian Navy. So when the ship reached the area between Tunisia and Sicily, somewhere in these waters, it struck the mine and sank. And when the Italian Navy rescued them, that was how my father became a political prisoner in Italy. So for the next 4 years, he was transferred through a series of internment camps in Italy until 1944, when he was deported from this area in Italy to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, which is approximately there. And he was a prisoner there for almost a year until the camp was liberated by the US Army at the end of the war. I'd like to say a word about Mauthausen within the context of the concentration camp system. As you know, there were different kinds of concentration camps. There were death and extermination camps, labor camps, prison camps, women's camps, transit camps. However, Mauthausen was the only camp that was specifically designated to work its prisoners to death. It was the only so-called death through work camp in the entire concentration camp system. About 200,000 people were imprisoned there over the life of the camp. And these included people from all the groups that the Nazis specifically targeted for extermination, and they are listed here. So the prisoner population was very diverse at Mauthausen. About 90,000 people were worked to death, tortured to death, or starved to death. over the life of the camp. My father witnessed the destruction of human life every day that he was at Mauthausen, which was almost a year. He was always wondering if he would be next. The result was that he was deeply traumatized by his experience there, so much so that he was virtually silent about it for over 40 years. But finally, in 1989, he opened up and began to talk about it. I never thought he would, because it had taken me over 20 years to get him to talk about it. So I want to play a few minutes of his very first conversation about his internment at Mauthausen. And this was the first oral history interview we had together. This excerpt is a bit less than 3 minutes.
And so then, after the war, where were you when the war ended?
I was in a camp in Austria.
In Austria, not in Germany.
No, in Germany, in Austria.
In
we
Austria.
came in from Italy. They took us to Austria.
By train.
Yeah, cattle, what the hell you call it?
A cattle car.
Yeah, cattle car.
Yeah.
Everybody, what a bundle in there.
And where in Austria?
It was up in a place, it's near to Graz. That's a concentration camp, one of those notorious concentration camps by Mauthausen. It's up on a hill. They had the crematoriums and the camps, you know. The barracks-like thing, you know, I had so many people in the barracks. So we were liberated in 1945, the 10th of May.
10th of May.
1945. About a couple of days before Hitler died.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh, that's interesting.
We were liberated by the Fifth Army, the American Fifth Army.
A couple of days afterward?
A couple of days before Hitler died.
Did you ever have any close calls?
Were you ever in, what kind of danger would you say you were in during that time?
Every day was dangerous. There wasn't a day that wasn't, considered. Sometimes you said, so how the hell they gonna get out of here? And then we heard so many, different things from the atrocities that the Germans was committing in the camps. Like before they leave, they kill everybody.
Right.
See if they have to run away. But we were up close to the place in Austria where we were. It was close to the Czechoslovakian border.
Uh-huh.
You can hear the Russian cannonading, and you can hear the concussion from the artillery,
Oh, yeah.
But how did you survive? This was one of the first questions I asked my father in that interview. He never answered this question, but there were a few reasons why he survived. Perhaps the main reason was because of his languages. Prisoners with language skills were often allowed to live longer than other prisoners because they could serve as interpreters. So my father had English as a native language. He had Dutch because he was from the Dutch side of St. Martin. He was able to learn German because of his Dutch. The German army took control of the Italian internment camp system about 1 or 2 years after my father was interned there. So he was forced to interact with the German soldiers. He was able to learn to speak German by interacting with them. He also knew Papiamento, which is a Spanish and Portuguese-based Creole spoken on the islands of Aruba and Curacao in the Caribbean. My father lived there for several years, so that's how he learned it. And it's related to Spanish, which he learned while he was living in Venezuela. And because of his background in Spanish, he was able to acquire Italian very easily. He understood all the Italian that he heard from the beginning when he first arrived in Italy. There were lots of prisoners in Mauthausen who spoke all of these European languages, so he was able to communicate with a lot of people. One of his nicknames was the translator. The subtitle of my book, which is From Papiamentu to German, pays tribute to the role of languages in my father's survival. I wrote the book about my father's wartime experience for a few reasons. Among them are that I wanted to weave another thread into the tapestry of African diaspora history in order to help complete the picture, because so much of it is missing. We as African diaspora people have to take control of and responsibility for our own narrative. It is because others have appropriated our narrative for so many centuries that we have not been in control of it, and oral history helps us take that control. Also, I wanted my book to exemplify how everyone has participated in or been a witness to historical events. And I wanted my book to serve as an example to others and encourage them to pursue oral histories with their families. My father's experience was an example of an untold story that only came to light because of oral history. This is my father immediately after the end of World War II, somewhere in Europe. In closing, I would just like to say that my father's oral history is the basis of this book that I wrote about his World War II experiences and my visits to Mauthausen. I hope that my experience with oral history will encourage you and others to embark on oral history projects with your families and members of your communities. So thank you very much.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about my book, Culturally Competent Nursing: An Evaluation Plan. So I wrote this book to be a guide and a resource for nurse educators and key decision makers to evaluate the way we approach teaching nursing students and preparing them for a career and a future in nursing. Now more than ever, this nation needs a workforce of nurses who understand the relationship between social determinants of health. Thus, this will require a transformation in healthcare, the healthcare system in general, but nursing education and, of course, nurses. So the need for a culturally competent healthcare system has become increasingly important within the United States and around the world. Despite efforts to integrate psychosocial and cultural competence education into healthcare curriculum, racial and ethnic disparities continue to persist. Since nurses represent the largest segment of healthcare professionals, it is imperative that they provide culturally congruent care and are highly skilled to reduce racial and ethnic gaps in healthcare. Nurse educators must effectively prepare pre-licensed nurses for improving the quality of care given to diverse populations within a multicultural workforce. Teaching and evaluation tools for classroom and clinical learning experiences will be explored in this book as strategies within an evaluation plan to enhance and measure the attainment of cultural competence within nursing education. With the assumption that cultural competence and diversity education has already been addressed in all areas of nursing curriculum and training within the nursing workforce, this book will mainly focus on evaluating the impact of those efforts and students' application of said cultural knowledge. An implementation plan will also be discussed to guide the curriculum revision process and comprehensive integration of cultural content. Nurse educators may find this book helpful in identifying simple ways to collect data to highlight areas where enhanced cultural content is needed within nursing curriculum. Overall, this evaluation plan will explore educational activities and tools for improving the teaching learning process. For example, within this book, we will discuss reflective writing assignments, a survey to capture daily experiences of racial discrimination, a rubric we'll be looking at how can we support nursing students with developing culturally congruent care plans. Also, a clinical evaluation tool. This is a clinical evaluation tool that measures core competencies. These should be observable behaviors and attitudes that the nursing instructor during clinical learning experiences should be able to see that nursing students have attained the knowledge that has been presented to them, whether it's through classroom instruction or whether it's through assignments and different research that the students will undertake in their learning. Also, there'll be a questionnaire for nurse educators. The questionnaire for nurse educators, I designed that questionnaire really as a way for nurse educators to measure how they are approaching teaching and if they're able to integrate specific strategies such as cultural immersion experiences, where nursing students are able to work directly with individuals from culturally diverse backgrounds. Particularly in this book, I talk about African Americans, and I specifically talk about African Americans because I understand that they are a vulnerable population. And one of the reasons why I focus on African Americans in particular, it's because of the history in this country with racism, discrimination in healthcare and all other institutions. So I look at the connection between hypertension management and African Americans. With hypertension management and African American population, and how we as nurse educators and nurses have to be able to move from providing care strictly in the inpatient setting to coordination of care in the outpatient setting, and helping address the issues such as social determinants of health that often create barriers for vulnerable populations. This book will offer a suggestion for a cultural immersion experience, as I just mentioned. This experience will be outlined further in this book as an intervention to offer nursing students exposure. Again, the importance about the exposure is because the nurse educators and the students alike need to have the exposure to culturally diverse patients. And why do we need an evaluation plan to look at nursing curriculum? A comprehensive evaluation plan is necessary to gauge when and how adjustments must be made to a nursing program design to improve the quality and effectiveness of resources for cultural enrichment of nursing education. Cultural competence education in both classroom and clinical instruction is integral to prepare nurses to provide culturally sensitive care to diverse patients. Nurse educators must be motivated to tackle the larger issue, that is conceptualizing cultural competency-based educational practices, and thus shifting cultural diversity from a challenge to an asset. This plan will delve into tools that nurse educators are able to utilize in the evaluation of nursing students' knowledge, application, and attitudes towards newly attained cultural content within the learning experience. Additionally, this plan will address the need to effectively measure how improved cultural knowledge can enhance cultural competence within the nursing workforce. In general, this evaluation plan, along with the implementation plan, is necessary for the collection of data to analyze the activities, feedback, and cooperation of all stakeholders. And so I'm just going to do a brief presentation of some of the information that's going to be covered in the book, and just to give you some more of a visual guide. So I actually wrote this paper when I was in graduate school, and it was looking at the impact of racism-related vigilance in the management of hypertension in African Americans. And essentially, when I wrote this paper, I was really thinking about how difficult I think it would be for anybody to manage some conditions such as hypertension, which is a chronic condition, but it's so tightly linked to stress. That is like the first thing that you're going to tell a patient if a patient has hypertension, to reduce their stress. But how do African Americans reduce their stress when they are dealing with so many obstacles? Anything from poor access to quality care, poor education, lack of transportation, in some cases, and living in dangerous neighborhoods for many. And so looking at identifying the problem, I borrow a quote from the American Public Health Association that defines racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race, that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly disadvantages, and unfairly, correct, advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And so this is directly from the paper that I wrote when I was in graduate school. And it was just looking pretty much at the biological response of racism-related vigilance. So it's really the activation of the stress response. And this is something that is a mechanism that is has been well documented, but it is often complex to understand the connection between hypertension, vigilance, and hypervigilance to be more specific. And so the biological stress response, this is usually the response that you have when you're having like fight or flight. Oftentimes that is what people usually describe it as. And if you are dealing with racism and discrimination, it is understood that this is probably what you are dealing with on a regular basis. How do you navigate school, and how do you navigate approaching maybe being new at a job? You know, you're new at your place of employment, and it's just you're the only person there. And this is how I felt when I was in graduate school, and I also felt like this when I was in nursing school, when I initially became a nurse. And so this is a largely reason why I wrote this book, as a way to kind of amplify the voices of students who may sometimes feel isolated if they are a part of the minority group. And so this discrimination survey is also included in this book. It's just really a way of looking at how race may be considered a factor for some people when they feel like they're getting less than quality or below standard services. And this is explored to really help people really explore how they're feeling about issues related to discrimination on a daily basis. Just anything, even for example, how you feel if you are getting less than quality services at, let's say, a restaurant, or customer service, you feel like you're not getting the correct information. You know, looking at how individuals may feel that their race is a factor in these instances. And so this is also a model that I had created. It went along with the paper. And I designed this to really capture the factors that lead into hypertension for African Americans when we're looking at hypervigilance. Okay, so some of these factors include lower socioeconomic status, daily exposure to psychological environmental stressors, a natural wear and tear of the body, predisposing individuals who are dealing with stress that is largely related to racism and discrimination. And nursing education. So the American Association of College of Nursing has highlighted some reasons why they really want to tackle this. And they really want to tackle this because they understand that for nursing students, a lack of minority nurse educators may indicate to students that there is not a value in nursing for diversity. It may signal that there's not an opportunity to advance in the profession, and it may also raise concerns about academic role models. And so again, here are some tools that are included in the book and some teaching strategies that will be described in this book. Again, there's a detailed timeline to describe how all of these strategies will be implemented and can be implemented in a curriculum revision plan. So there's a detailed evaluation plan, there's a detailed implementation plan, and there's also a detailed timeline. And really the goal is to get everyone at the table, your key decision makers, your students, your nurse educators in the clinical and classroom environment, really at the same place, and really kind of getting feedback from everybody, because this curriculum revision process will affect so many different people. So all the stakeholders actually have to have a voice. So this is essentially the reason why I had embarked on writing this book and covering such a grand project. And it definitely was a grand project. I'm trying even now to contain myself with some of the ideas that I would love to discuss here, but I would definitely say my primary goal was really to make sure that I was amplifying the voices of particularly African-American students, but students of color who may feel isolated when they are the only, or they're part of a very small group of students in a nursing program. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And if you'd like to reach out to me, oh, sorry, before I end, how can I forget? So there's an evaluation tool here. This evaluation tool is based on the American Association of College of Nurses. They've outlined 5 core competencies in cultural competent nursing education. And so this is similar to the evaluation tool that is included in the book. So I don't want to take up too much time, but this tool is just as detailed as this tool is. I have a similar one in the book. And essentially, this is a tool that I believe can be used to help measure in the clinical learning opportunities, our nursing students demonstrating cultural competency when they are performing the skills that they have been taught when they were in the classroom instruction and in their theory learning. So thank you again for this opportunity. If you would like to reach out to me, you can reach out to me at advancednurses@acd4n.com. My name is Rackelle Wilkinson-Aston. And again, my book is Culturally Competent Nursing and Evaluation Plan. And I am looking forward to hearing feedback from readers and also from nurse educators and other researchers who are looking in this area of nursing education or healthcare curriculum and really want to make a change. Thank you.
Am Robin Brooks, an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh and author of Class Interruptions, Inequality and Division in African Diasporic Women's Fiction. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it has taught us that class inequality is real. My book focuses on inequalities associated with housing, education, and employment. Inequalities which this pandemic has highlighted, and many Black communities across the African diaspora are being disproportionately impacted. This is not a coincidence. A variety of factors, including the continued history of systemic racism, racial capitalism, and contemporary neoliberalism, for example, have helped lay the groundwork for this disproportionate impact that we are experiencing. So the title of my book, Class Interruptions, reveals my primary goal, which is to interrupt the lack of attention and scholarship on class, particularly in the humanities. And this interruption aims to destabilize an unjust status quo. My hope really is that readers better understand current socioeconomic and political climates across the globe, and that people are prompted to practice and nourish their class consciousness, even if the impact is diffuse and does not directly or immediately end in policy overhauls. This book really facilitates a conversation between the humanities and the social sciences, as the literary writers in my book are invested in the same inequality phenomena as social scientists. And I focus on Black women writers to learn what, if any, interventions these writers are making amid what is often called the feminization of poverty, meaning women represent the majority of the disenfranchised across the world. Now, I want to say that concerning class, a major point of agreement among scholars across fields who study class is that terms like class, working class, and middle class do not fit into neat categories. They are often controversial and contested. The scholarly consensus is that class shifts and is shaped by historic events, as we are now seeing with this pandemic. Therefore, it is necessary to analyze classes in relation to one another. Various matters, including cultural ones, influence ideas about class. Notions of class also vary within different nations and geographical regions. Of course, I am certainly mindful of this in this book on African American writers like Don Turner and Toni Morrison, and Anglophone Caribbean writers from Jamaica and Trinidad like Olive Singer and Merle Hodge. Of course, intersectionality, made popular by Kimberly Crenshaw, is a central part and crucial part of my book. I emphasize class in order to better understand the many dimensions of the Black feminist theory of intersectionality. Class permeates our everyday lives, and it should not simply be relegated to obviously class-invoking subjects like labor unions or political parties. The landscape of work across the globe has dramatically changed over the past few decades due to things like globalization and neoliberalism. My book adds to the larger modern historiography of class. It is interdisciplinary in nature and is in conversation with a lot of great scholars from different fields, including Africana studies, literary studies, working class studies, women's studies, history, anthropology, sociology, and economics. And I engage people like Andrea Williams, Candace Jenkins, Carol Boyce Davies, Robin Kelly, Jennifer Morgan, Derek Hamilton, Eric Olin Wright, Karen Lacey, Sherry Lincoln, and Anika Henderson. And I want to note that one challenging chapter in the book deals with the intersection of class, sexual violence, and racial capitalism. I think that this chapter, which is my second chapter on sexual violence, can be triggering for some people. So I wanted to make sure that I was very careful with that chapter. I do discuss taboo topics, so to speak, including historical legacies of rape, child molestation, sexual grooming, and so forth. I began the chapter with something that's very popular in the media, which is the Me Too movement. And I focus on Tarana Burke. And the chapter shows the very ugly history of the sexual violation of Black people, women and men, and how this is tied to racial capitalism. Black people were both labor and capital. They were producers and reproducers. And in this chapter, I emphasize the sexual abuse of Black men and boys, going back to the institution of slavery, which is often not discussed. And this history of sexual violation has literally bled into different types of relationships among Black people themselves, whether community relationships or intimate relationships. So whether you are an organizer, an activist, someone working on economic policy, or someone who is just interested in learning more about class inequality, this is a book you should read. I want anybody interested in eliminating inequalities and learning more about them to read my book. I want people to recognize the significance, the great significance of paying attention to the role of class and people's lived experiences. We really need to stop shaming people for their circumstances that stem from structural inequalities. In the book, I explain in real detail, great detail, that the highly stratified extremes we are witnessing today did not just come out of the blue. There are laws and policies right now that have facilitated these extremes that we are currently living, especially with contemporary neoliberalism beginning in the 1970s. Societies are making the choice to continue with destructive practices, and so they can make the choice to stop these practices. So I am a person who is very much so focused on solutions, and my book definitely shows that. And so I want to say that specifically, governments can start choosing to require paid sick leave, to raise the minimum wage further across the board, to provide affordable health care, to ensure basic services for everyone, for example. And ultimately, my book, Class Interruptions, is a forward-looking and solution-oriented book. As the Black Lives Matter movement reminds us, imagination is important. Everything that exists now was once imagined. And these literary artists that I focus on in my book, they are imagining just socioeconomic systems where people's basic needs are met, no matter the intersections of their makeup. And so I just want to really encourage you to invest in not only buying this book, but actually reading it and learning from it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dr. Eve Taylor, and I am the author of The Torn Fabric, The Racial Divide, and Black and White. I've written this book because I recognize that the torn fabric of America happened in the great United States of America. And if you want to get a copy of this book, you can get it on Amazon.com, or if you want to get a personalized autographed copy from me, you can email me at tayloreve335@gmail.com. That is tayloreve335@gmail.com. Or you can go to my website at www.dreevetaylor.com. I will give you this information again before I conclude with my presentation. So, The Torn Fabric of America, the book was written from a place of recognizing our past is still our present. George Washington, our first president, believe it or not, had 123 slaves. And our 45th president, in my opinion, has enslaved a political party that believes in an alternative truth. My perspective comes from growing up as a little brown girl in South Georgia, where I personally experienced the Jim Crow days, and I personally was called the N-word while my father was standing present beside me, who my mom had to pull him to make sure my father would not get into an altercation with a Jim Crow person. And so therefore, I have a living testimony of what racism is all about. But growing up in the South, I had an opportunity to read about Harry Tubman, George Washington Carver, and Martin Luther King, Mary Cloud Bethune, and many others. So growing up and learning what civil rights really mean, I determined that one day when I grow up, I did not know that I would be writing this book, The Torn Fabric of America, The Racial Divide in Black and White, with this title. Let me tell you how I came to that title. In June of 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, I saw then that the American flag was being ripped apart and the American divide was occurring before our eyes on a nationwide television when he was lying on the ground begging for his life. And I said then, there is going to be a racial divide. Little did I know that I would not come to the place to determine that I would be writing the book about the racial divide of Black and white. So having written this book, I understand that even today, we're still experiencing the civil rights movement that takes away our voting rights, that is taking away our liberty and the justice that we should not have to endure with all of our Black men being murdered in the streets and our young girls and sisters being murdered in their homes. So therefore, as a 75-year-old Afro-American woman who wrote the book at 75 years old, I said to myself, in this presentation, the readers will come to understand that the torn fabric of America, the racial divide, you will understand the slave root, cause, and effect. And I wrote from the place of writing about the Emancipation Proclamation, and I go into detail to talk about our Constitution. So the question would be, are we emancipated, or is there an emancipation? So since living and experiencing the civil rights movement, when I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, I also volunteered during the civil rights movement where I was a member of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. And I got to work with civil rights leaders like Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and also during that time, I did not know that I was really learning what civil rights really meant to all Afro-Americans. Today, I would say, if 50 years ago we had Supreme Court justices who understood and understand the plight of Black people, I chronicalized in the book several chapters. And one of the great chapters that I speak about in chapter 7 is the revolution after the death of George Floyd that occurred, where we see and saw young white kids marching with Black kids arm in arm, because I do believe that the racism that had taken place in our great America had not been exposed to the young kids. As they say, the 70s generation, the baby boomers, they taught hate. They teach hate. But then this was something that I decided to write about in the book, that it could not be put under a candle or a bush, and it could not be hidden any further. So they saw for themselves on a nationwide television screen what racism, xenophobia, and having a president that spew out the venom that says alternative truth. They don't believe in the truth. So you will find that out in the book. And another chapter that I am very impressed with, because it comes from a place of my experience, is called Removing the Stain of Slavery. Is it possible? I believe it is possible because as a born-again, spirit-filled Christian, we all have to learn how to forgive, but we don't forget. The word says, forgive 7 times 70. And so I write a passage. Afro-Americans today are still experiencing, how do we get to, I write a passage where we have a right to freedom, liberty, and the justice for all. So in the book, it is an easy read. And I also talk about, as I talk about, I write a passage that continues in America today, the great white hope that we have not experienced. When I say white hope, I mean the purity of hope. I mean not the subliminal, but the actual fact that we live on hope every day for Afro-Americans, and we toil and we attempt to teach our kids what it means. So the torn fabric of America, when we witness, little did I know, when I got this chapter, June of 2020, that I did not know I will witness January 6th, 2021, what the torn fabric of America really looked like. What the torn fabric of America looked like on January 6, 2021, where we had a 45th president wanting to, and still does today, claim that our democracy is not our democracy, attacks every man and woman, boy and girl in the United States of America. And because I also concluded that because of slavery, what was done in the past, it still exists today. When we had George Washington, the very first president, as I said, was a slave owner. We are no longer enslaved or in prison, but we are treated as though we're less than human because we do not deserve the right to present ourselves in a free country where we have the right to express ourselves, convey our thoughts. And then we have what now is the talking point of critical race theory. Does anyone know what critical race theory really means? For me, I took the word critical. Critical simply means that for all Afro-Americans, we have been living under a critical timeline where it is critical for us to understand that we are free and free indeed, and we should not allow ourselves to be enslaved to mere words where people try to put us in a bubble and treat us like we do not have the right to be free. So the torn fabric of America on January 6th, everybody can see it. And this will be a reason why I would suggest everybody to get a copy of my book, because I go into great detail, not knowing that we will live to witness January 6th, the demonic attitude and behavior, where if this were Black people scaling the walls of our United States Capitol, the carnage of death, the stench of death will still be at the Capitol. Although there were lives lost because of that, I would say you want to get a copy of the book. I know that Patrick Henry said, and I want to read this because I want to quote it accurately. Patrick Henry said, and I quote, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains, and slavery forbid it? Almighty God, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And I speak about that in one of the chapters of the book, where we as Afro-Americans, we have stood the test of time. We are still standing the test of time. Slavery will not defeat us. As we know, Mary McLeod Bethune, Harriet Tubman, we rise up. I know that when Reverend Al Sharpton wrote the book, Rise Up, I know that when Maya Angelou wrote the poem, Still We Rise, we have to still rise. And I give credit for them that as I read and study about our great American history, that we all has to rise up. And I want to share with you once again that if you want to get a copy of my book, go to Taylor Eve 335 at gmail.com, or you can go to my website, dreevetaylor.com, or you can order it online from Amazon. And again, I say, as an Afro-American Black woman, 75 years old, having lived through the era of the Jim Crow era, while learning stories about Harriet Tubman and growing up and learning what civil rights really mean to Black people, shaped my viewpoint through my life experiences, education, and time walking beside great leaders. And I know that from that point forward, my life has been forever changed as I have traveled throughout the continent of Africa and going to the Ivory Coast and going to the door of no return in Ghana. It has helped me to understand as I look at the seashores, I say to myself, how many Africans and my ancestors' bodies may lay at the foot of the seashore, someplace that I will never know. There is no trace, but I do know this, that we are here today. We cannot be turned around and we cannot be put under, because we have a strong belief and a strong faith. Because in the old tradition of Baptist church, we said we'd sing, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last, and we are free. So the torn fabric of America, the racial divide of Black and white, we need to understand both the culture in which we live in, and we need to try to amend all the carnage and the wrongs that has been gendered towards us as Black Americans. So I again say, you want to get a copy of the book, you want to go to Amazon.com, but if you want a copy from me that's autographed, you can go send me your email at tayloreve335@gmail.com. And in there, email, express to me what you would want me to write as far as the personal autograph for the book. So it has been my pleasure to come before you, and I will say, you want to get a copy of this great book? It's only 250 pages, but it's a great read and it's an easy read. So again, go to my website at www.dreve.com, and you can get a copy of this great book. So I pray and hope that everybody will be blessed. I want to thank you for this opportunity that I am here with you tonight to say, to God be the glory, and to all, I say bless you for this phenomenal opportunity, and God will bless us all when we stand firmly supporting one another, because with one, we can only do so much. But if we link ourselves together in spirit and in truth, God will be with us all. God bless. Thank you so much. Take care.
Well, hello, good evening. My name is Anita Russell, and it's a pleasure to be here as one of the authors featured on the Asala book event this evening. I am the author of I Want to See Laney's House, a sibling story. And this book is a personal narrative. It's a faith journey, and it's based on my belief that freedom is the absence of fear. It's based on this idea of the absence of fear taking a long time to overcome, nearly 6 decades for me to abolish fear from my life. It began with childhood trauma and grief, the fear that eventually manifested itself as guilt and inadequacy, fear of greatness, me playing small throughout different portions of my life, and definitely the fear of giving God complete control over my life. God is now the boss of my life, and this book chronicles my journey toward giving him control. So as you can hear by what I've said so far, I'm very much a faith-based individual. I had lots of things happen in my life where God literally showed up for me. And so that is the bedrock of who I am. So I'm going to jump into giving you a little bit of the backstory, actually, of the book. And I'm going to start with a quote from the preface of the book. And this book, incidentally, was my very first book as an independently published author. So it's something that I'm really, really proud of. Like the dash on a tombstone, my personal narrative is the tale of a wilderness journey nestled between the loss of 2 of the most important people in my life. The first loss I liken as a doorway into the wilderness, fraught with trauma, guilt, and depression. The second, a doorway out of the wilderness, abounding with celebration and inspiration and purpose. So I see the wilderness as a place where ordinary life is suspended, where my identity was shifted and new possibilities emerged over the entire course of my lifetime. My ordinary life was suspended at the age of 5. My identity shifted between the age of 40 and 55, and new possibilities emerged at the age of 60 when I finally found my own voice. So in my family, I am one of the storytellers. I am 64 years old, and over the course of my lifetime, that actually represents 33 million minutes that I have been alive. And every single moment of experience is like a dot on a pointillism painting that tells my story. And it's a story that holds 5 seasons of personal transformation, reframing my personal identity, the presence of racism, finding truth, and stepping towards self-liberation. So in my little girl season, I found myself in a very dark place, a dark night of the soul, as it were, at the bottom of a spiral staircase, a place of childhood trauma, depression, fear, and guilt. In the 5th year of my life, from September to January, I witnessed the death of my sister Lainey. I was molested, and I stood outside of my house and watched as embers from the house fire floated all around me. After the fire, we moved away, and I was surrounded by new people, a new school, and a new sense of not belonging. What I know now is those adverse childhood events shaped my life, my sense of self, and a feeling of being disconnected. So next, I move into this awakening adolescent. In 1971, I experienced racial hatred firsthand, standing outside of the newly formed Steel Valley Intermediate School. The new school district was an attempt to merge and integrate 3 neighboring communities, Homestead, Munhall, and West Homestead. On one particular day, the school had been evacuated because of a bomb threat, fueled by anger that white students had been forced into the classroom with Black students. So it was a time of reframing my identity against the backdrop of mountainous afros, Black pride, seeing myself as young, gifted, and Black, and trying to figure out what's going on all around me. It was also a time of reckoning with the remnants of my inner turmoil, depression, and suicidal ideation. Once I got to college, I entered a whole new season of nurturing young adult. And in this season of my life, my identity took on a whole different meaning. So during my time at the University of Pittsburgh, I was reunited, I should say, with the paternal side of my family. My identity went from being flat to multidimensional as I learned so much about those now visible branches on my family tree. I protested the firing of Dr. Curtis Porter, a Black professor who was instrumental in birthing the Black Studies Department at the University of Pittsburgh. And his Black consciousness class was probably one of the most valuable courses that I had at the university. I also had the opportunity to meet Gil Scott-Heron, and that sort of genre, if you will, helped me to really begin to understand and make the connection between racism in America and apartheid in South Africa. And I would say the biggest lesson that I learned in college was not really academic at all. It was much more social. And what I learned is that I am not going to like everybody that I meet. And everybody that I meet is not going to like me either. But I was okay with that because I was finally beginning to truly like myself. So after college came the season of evolving into a grown woman. My identity now took on the title of mother. And it was a period of critical self-reflection because my responsibility and accountability moved from single to family. And the last thing I wanted was to do something or anything that would hurt or otherwise jeopardize the future of my children. And so I became the consummate protector of my babies. Then yearnings of a liberated woman became a very poignant part of my life. And this is actually the season of life that I live in today. But it was also in this season that I learned the true meaning of Marianne Williamson's words. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure, and it is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. And so I was in the process of discovering that light within myself and discovering how to really speak in my own voice. So in this season, I left corporate America, started my own business as a transformational life coach. As a little girl, I lost my sister, which plunged me into that space that took me years to overcome. And years later, it was my mother who liberated me from that final thing that haunted me about my sister's death. The accident happened in 1962. But my mother and I never had a conversation about that day until 2017. I had always wondered what that day was like for her, but it was just something that the family never talked about. But in 2017, I found out that my mother had stage 4 metastasized breast cancer. And as she moved closer to the end of her life, she began to open up and talk to my brothers and me. So she told us how she had made her peace with God and wasn't afraid to die, and that she couldn't wait to see Lainey's house. And we finally talked about the day that Lainey died. And hearing her story was quite liberating for me because I no longer had to guess. And it helped me to see the light of her love in a completely different way. So over the course of these 5 seasons of my personal life, I've learned 2 valuable lessons. First, that every minute contributes to your life story, and your life story contributes to the history of this nation. And second, life is about mastering your becoming space, that space between where you are and where you truly desire to be. And so I'd like to leave you with this final quote. In the hope that the words in my story bring you to the realization that Maya Angelou's words directly apply to you. My mission in life is to not merely survive, but to thrive, and to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style. And consider this: if the Creator's original intention was life eternal and the fulfillment of purpose, then there's no limit to your gifts, talents, and abilities. There's no limit to the power you have to fulfill your dreams and to thrive. And there is no limit to the phenomenal things that you can birth into this world. And my life is a testimony to everything that I just said, to these main lessons that I have learned in my life. What I've experienced is a testimony to all of that. I started off as a broken individual, worked my way through all of that, had a very successful career in the pharmaceutical industry, started off as a scientist in that industry, and then moved into learning and development. And that learning and development role is what put me on the path towards the business that I have today as a transformational life coach. And so my purpose in life coaching is just helping people to kind of experience some of those transformational changes that I've had in my own life, experience what it means to really come to know who you are in the essence of your own identity, identified and defined by you, and not necessarily from people or individuals or society outside of who you are. And when you think about us as Black folks, it's really important that we have a very strong sense of who we are within the context of our own lived experiences and how all of that relates to historical truth. And so I just want to thank you very much for listening and taking the time out with me as I shared some information with you, my backstory behind I Want to See Laney's House, a sibling story. So I thank you again for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I'll see you soon.